We will take questions at the end of Julio's talk, which is titled The Effects of Instruction on Heritage Language Learners. Welcome, Julio.
Thank you so much for that, for that introduction. I'm very happy to join the Cornell community, language teaching community, even if it's virtually. I was telling the team that I'm sort of disappointed not to be there in person, right? But this is our new reality. So we are adapting here, but trying to make things work. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's a really, it's a great honor, especially after looking through the website and the great program and speakers that you've had at Cornell. So as Angelica stated, I'm going to talk today about the effects of instruction on heritage language learners. But to kick things off, I'm going to begin with a video to help us set the tone for the talk about some of the research that I'll be talking about. So I will say ahead of time, I apologize. The video, there are like 3 curse words, so I hope no one gets offended. But I think it's such a good video to contextualize, right, the issues that I'll be addressing. So here we go.
Is there an accent on que? ¿Qué tú quieres? Palomo.
Haha, what a funny cold open. One thing that my coworkers pride themselves on is their bilingualness. Wait, is that a word? As for me, I'm only partially bilingual and struggle with the language quite a bit. I'm gonna take out all my frustrations and give them a Spanish pop quiz. I had a Spanish instructor create a test based on some things I heard around the office.
I am confident in the sense that I grew up with it. I only speak Spanish at home. Having said that, I suck at accents and I suck at taking tests about Spanish.
I'm mad confident in my Spanish. I was born speaking Spanish. English is my second language. Writing it, of course, I text in Spanish all the time. Of course, I know how to write in Spanish. Okay, I haven't written in Spanish in such a long time.
The official language of Curly is neither English or Spanish, it's Spanglish. I'm not the best at Spanish and I'm not the best at English, but I'm super good at Spanglish.
I don't know how I'm gonna do on this test. I keep thinking I speak well, but I'm also like, the Dominican in me is like, ooh girl, you about to fail. I think that the only problem that I have is like my accents on things and like putting the ñ on it, I'm like,
all the accent marks in the following passage have been omitted. Write them in. No, that's what I have Siri and Espanol for.
Accent marks? This is what I'm saying. Álvaro, hijo.
¿Por qué no querías ir con tu papá a Bogotá?
Does hijo have one?
If I'm gonna put one there, who knows?
Papa, there's an accent there. A Bogotá, there's an accent there.
Angel? Nah, why not?
Ir, I think, should have one.
Dang, I don't know.
I don't understand. Can I skip?
¿Por qué no querías? Is there an accent on que?
This is some bullshit.
Maya, I hate you.
Put in bisabuelo. No? It sounded like a beast.
I got none right. This is 0.
There's an accent on que and por qué.
As soon as you said it, I knew where it was.
No on Eve?
No. Are you kidding me?
Of course.
I know that.
Since when we put accent on names, people?
I don't dislike you, but I don't like you either. Ooh, this is simple, but it's not this one.
No es que no me gustas. Is that right? Let me mix that.
No es que no me gustas. I would say no me caes bien. Ah.
Tú no me disgustas, pero no te quiero tampoco.
That one had me messed up.
I was totally fucking overthinking that one.
Desgusta is the exact translation of dislike. Either way, I got this shit right. You know what I mean, son?
I don't like politics with politics like me. A mí no me caen bien los politics. I don't know.
No me gustan los políticos, pero los políticos me gustan a mí.
Yo no quiero la política, pero la política me quiere a mí.
Oh, no me gusta la política, pero a la política le gusto. Ahí, tú viste.
No me gustan las políticas, pero las políticas le gustan a mí. But I would never even say the sentence anyways. You would never hear that sentence come out of my mouth, so I don't need to learn it.
You know, when I was writing it, I was thinking about that because when you say that me gustan a mí, it's still saying you're liking it. Okay. All right, he got me there.
But you can also say quiero for like, but in this formal setting, it's gotta be gusta.
I think I learned that I need to pay more attention to the way that people speak and how they use their tenses, because I think I just get a little lazy with it, but I'm like, they know what I meant.
Take that, Spain. You ain't got shit on me.
You never stop learning in this life, and this is a huge lesson.
Mommy, I'm so happy and I know you will be proud of me.
Okay, so I'm gonna make a few observations from that clip, right? From the Pero-like people. The first thing that we observe, right? So these are all heritage speakers, okay? Which is the population I will be talking about today. And we see the linguistic insecurity in many of them, among many of them. So for example, Maya at the beginning of the video talks about being partially bilingual. And right, we ask ourselves, well, what does that even mean to be partially bilingual, right? Again, showing this linguistic insecurity. The second thing we see that there's a range of language abilities among the group, and this is very common among heritage speakers, right? So we saw that also reflected on the grades. I mean, I'm not sure they were graded, right? But we saw the different grades on the test. And finally, also, I would mention that we also need to think about this type of assessment that they were given, right? I think the assessment is a little problematic because it does not really reflect the way heritage speakers use language in real life. It's not to say that accents are not important, or, right, perhaps some type of translation exercises. But if you notice one of the characters, Curly, he says, I won't even say that sentence, okay? So again, it's not the way they will use language. So I wonder whether if other appropriate, more appropriate assessments we were use more appropriate assessments for them, whether or not they would do better. So in this context, it's sort of the issues that surround heritage language speakers and their use of the heritage language. So, to be clear here, of who is a heritage language speaker, like the staff or the people that we saw in Pero-like, right? They need to be at least bilingual, okay? And I'm using the term here bilingual to meaning in a broad sense, in that they can have just receptive knowledge of the heritage language all the way to having literacy skills in a heritage language. So when I talk about them being bilingual, it can be along this continuum. The heritage language is a minority language in their context, so that right, that is that it is not the majority language of the society at large. So for example, in the United States, our majority language here is English, even though it's not an official language. It is still the majority language, and any other languages we speak at home, whether German, Korean, Japanese, those would be minority languages. And the third criterion for to characterize a heritage speaker for me is that there's an ancestral affinity to the heritage language. That is that they have some sort of family connection to that heritage language. So if we look at these three attributes of who a heritage language speaker is, we can imagine that this would entail a lot of people. So I want to talk about the subset of individuals that I've been looking at in my own research. So number one, I'm going to be talking about early bilinguals, early heritage speakers. That means that these are heritage speakers that started acquiring the heritage language at an early age. And also that these are individuals who for some reason or another are motivated to study the heritage language in a classroom setting. And when this occurs, then they become heritage language learners. So this is the population that I will be specifically talking about in today's talk. So we know a few things about heritage language speakers, heritage language bilinguals, thanks to a lot of research that has been conducted by colleagues in the field of social linguistics, and mostly in social linguistics and in theoretical linguistics. So the first thing I want to say we know is that these heritage speakers acquire the language in a naturalistic environment, right? In a naturalistic context. So what does this mean? This means that their exposure to the heritage language is mostly at home and or in many times in their communities. And in this naturalistic environment, they are engaging more in oral communication to use the heritage language. This does not preclude, obviously, that heritage speakers cannot acquire literacy skills at home and in the community. That certainly can happen, and it does, but that for the most part, they're engaging in oral communication with the heritage language. The second thing is that they are native speakers. So in the beginnings of early beginnings of the field of heritage language studies, people would say, oh, these are heritage speakers and these are native speakers. So colleagues in the field have challenged that, and rightly so. And now we consider and we accept that heritage speakers are in fact native speakers because they do behave like native speakers in many ways. However, we also know from the research that they can behave differently to a certain extent, to certain degrees, from monolingual native speakers. And it is because they're not monolingual native speakers, they are bilingual native speakers. As such, we ought to not expect them to behave like monolingual speakers of the language. Because, why? Because they're living with two grammars in their daily lives. As such, the heritage language, because they're living with two languages, we characterize it as being a dynamic and an adaptive linguistic system. By dynamic, I mean that the language can fluctuate and can change from time to time, depending on the life events of the heritage bilingual. So one clear example is children, for example, who are growing up in a household in which they are speaking mostly the heritage language in a monolingual environment at home, but then they go to school at the age of 4 or 5, and especially if they enter a school system that does not support the heritage language, we're going to see that there's going to be a shift in their language, linguistic knowledge of the heritage language because of this experience, right? So again, when we say that the system is dynamic, it is prone to fluctuation and to changes depending on the environment of the heritage language bilingual. And as such, heritage bilinguals adapt their linguistic resources depending on the context, and this occurs when the heritage language comes into contact with another language, or when the heritage language comes into contact with another variety of the heritage language. As I mentioned, one of the observations from the video that there is quite a range of language abilities among heritage speakers and they demonstrate variability of linguistic knowledge more so than monolingual speakers. In fact, we have evidence from studies that have shown that depending on the type of experimental task we use in a study, that can determine the extent to which we can elicit linguistic knowledge or particular linguistic structure from heritage language bilinguals. And finally, I will say that the linguistic knowledge that they acquire based on this experience mostly in a naturalistic environment is going to be mostly oral, right? Because they're using the heritage language a lot more often in oral communication, but is also going to be mostly implicit in that they can use the language really well, they can produce many structures. However, they may, oftentimes they're unaware of the rules that govern the use of language. So I want to say that if we take all of these traits, right, these characteristics that we know from research with heritage language speakers, and I'm going to call this prior language experience, right? So unlike second language learners, the key difference between second language learners and heritage language learners is that our heritage language learners are going to bring this experience with them into the classroom setting. In 2001, Guadalupe Valdez, right, a professor at Stanford University, wrote that heritage learners bring functional knowledge into the learning scenario. So this is sort of what the functional knowledge looks like. So in my research, what I've attempted to look at is how does this prior language experience that they bring with them interacts with instruction, and what are the outcomes of that instruction. And that's sort of what I will be talking about today. So recently, my colleague Melissa Bowles from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and I conducted what we called an exploratory meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is basically a study that analyzes primary studies in the field that look at the effects of a particular variable on a particular outcome. So for example, in our case, we looked at primary studies that have looked at the effects of instruction on heritage language learning. So what we did is we synthesized these studies using quantitative methods, and we found the following. So here, to walk you through this D here is what we refer to as a Cohen's D. Cohen's D basically tells us the magnitude that instruction has in heritage language learning. So here's some good news. What we found that the preliminary studies out there that have been conducted thus far show that instruction has a positive and moderate effect on heritage language learning. So this is a medium or moderate effect. So that's some good news that instruction is helping heritage language learners. However, I do want to point out, if we compare this effect size to meta-analyses conducted in the field of second language acquisition, we find here a difference. And here we see with second language learners, we have consistent results that instruction plays a large role in their learning, okay? So the question is, why is that? Right? Why doesn't instruction play a larger role for heritage language learners? So I want to be very clear on something to not misinterpret this, right? I am not trying to say here that we ought to be comparing heritage language learners to second language learners. I don't think that's a fair comparison because there are two different types of bilingual. But because the field of instructed heritage language acquisition is a new field, I think it's interesting to make these comparisons to take a look at the issues at stake. So two questions we can think of two questions. Number one is that, well, Julio, you can say the effects of instruction are not as large for heritage language learners because it's not urgent for them, right, to learn the heritage language in the classroom. So again, heritage learners, we need to keep in mind, come with these linguistic resources, and these linguistic resources that they have serve them very well in their communities, at home, to communicate with their family and their loved ones, right? And they engage with these linguistic resources, they engage in translanguaging practices and so forth. So it might be for the heritage learner, well, it's not that urgent for me, right, to learn, as for a second language learner that basically come to us with a blank slate. But the second question I would like to pose is the following, that it may be that perhaps some of the methods or pedagogical models or interventions that are used in studies with second language learners may not be as efficient for heritage language learners. So in other words, we may need to look at more research, and we need more research in this area to really try to understand how heritage learners respond to instruction in order to design appropriate pedagogical models for their learning. So in the second part of the talk, I'll be talking about specific studies in order to try to get at that question. And basically in my research, I used the framework of task-based language teaching, or TBLT, in order to look at heritage language learners. So if you are not familiar with TBLT, is essentially an educational framework for language learning in which tasks are the central unit or the main unit to create instruction and assessments, right? And I will briefly define task as any language activity that imitates the real world, in which learners need to either solve a problem or they need to reach a communicative goal. And importantly, they must do so relying primarily on their own linguistic resources, okay? And we will see examples of tasks in the studies that I'm going to show you. So before I begin with my own research, I do want to acknowledge my dear colleagues who have contributed to this area. Unfortunately, due to time, and I will not go over their studies, and also I would be afraid to not do justice to their research, but I wanted to point out that other people have contributed to this literature. And at the end of the talk, I will give a few recommendations, right, or takeaway messages. And when I wrote those up, it's taking and keeping in mind these studies as well. Okay, so why do I even choose task-based language teaching? So I want to be very clear. I'm not here to advocate that task-based language teaching is the panacea. It's a panacea and it's going to solve all of our problems. In fact, there are other pedagogical models in the field of heritage language pedagogy, right? But I'm going to explain why I choose TBLT as a framework. And number one is because it's research-based pedagogy. So from the mid-1980s, we have a wealth of empirical evidence, which is helpful in order to make predictions and in order to test certain claims. I often work with teachers and I tell them, if researchers or people who are promoting a pedagogical model is not showing you data or showing you evidence for the effectiveness, right, you should be suspicious of such models. So the one thing I like about TBLT is that it's research-based. The second thing about TBLT is that, yes, Julio, great that it's research-based, but can I implement this in the classroom? So for those of us who are practitioners, right, and who are teaching, right, also TBLT provides a method in order to do it in the classroom. So that's a second reason. The third reason is this concept of task-specific motivation. And task-specific motivation is basically measuring learners' motivation before they do a task, during the completion of a task, and after they completed a task. And I have been involved with a colleague in measuring task-specific motivation with heritage learners. And one of my former students, who's a teacher in Chicago at a high school, conducted an action research project examining the effects of tasks on her heritage learners in a Spanish 1 class. So the nice thing is that the emerging evidence from these two studies suggests that students find tasks, when they are appropriately designed, to be relevant and meaningful to their learning experience. So as we know, as teachers, as practitioners, right, that when our learners are engaged, are motivated, and are engaged with our pedagogical materials, right, that is going to open a door, right, to make learning somewhat easier, we hope. So the first study that I will go over is a study on language development. So in this study, the target form for this study is the subjunctive and adjectival clauses. Okay, so I will explain what this is real quickly. So for example, here in the sentence, Felipe needs a translator who studies Romanian, right? This is an example of an adjectival clause. So we have here, Felipe needs a translator. So this will be the matrix clause, right? And we have here this referent in the matrix clause. So the adjectival clause here, who studies Romanian, is qualifying or describing the referent in the matrix clause, right? So this is what an adjectival clause is. So if you notice, there are two sentences here in Spanish, and even if you don't speak Spanish, right, you see here that the verb study differs, right, in both sentences, one with this A and one with this E. And basically here, the difference is that the first sentence is expressing indicative mood, and the second sentence is expressing subjunctive mood. In Spanish, we use inflectional morphology, right, to mark these distinctions between indicative and subjunctive mood. However, if you look at it in English, right, we still have this, the verb ending in English is the same for both cases. So how do we disambiguate this in English? Well, we rely on pragmatic context. So for example, in this sentence, in this case, call Maria or Lupe. This indicates to us that this translator exists, okay? It's either Maria or Lupe who study Romanian. We need to get a hold of one of them. So in Spanish, the indicative mood is going to be used when the referent, okay, this antecedent here that we're describing in the adjectival clause exists, and we know that this person is there. This translator is available. Okay. However, in the second sentence in English, we would say call the translation agency to see if they have someone. So in this case, this translator, we're not sure if he or she exists. Therefore, this requires in Spanish the use of the subjunctive if the speaker does not know the existence of the referent in the matrix clause. So heritage language learners, when we study their grammars, right, these are studies in both in theoretical and sociolinguistics, have found that heritage learners tend to put the indicative form in the sentence number 2, where we should have subjunctive, okay? So in this case, what I was trying to do in this experiment is, can I teach heritage learners and second language learners, by the way, also were part of this experiment, can I teach them this subjunctive, okay, using a task-based approach? Okay, hopefully that was clear for you all. So this is the task. So I created a computerized task, and basically I told participants that they were hired as residence directors, right? These were all undergraduate students, by the way. They were hired as residence directors at the University of Puerto Rico. And at the end of the semester, the Dean of Student Life was concerned about some of the behavior going on in the dorms. So their task was to try to explain to the Dean of Student Life some of the disconcerting behavior occurring in the dorm. So I want to be very clear. those were the only instructions that the participants got. The participants were not exposed or were not told that they were going to learn the subjunctive. They were not given any lesson on the use of the subjunctive at all, right? They were told, this is your task goal, go, your mission is to solve this task, right? And explain these behaviors. So what participants saw is they saw a sentence. For example, some students are playing really loud music. Okay, so they saw what was the disconcerting behavior. Then they would be exposed to this icon here, this image, which represented the residence director and saying whether or not they knew the behavior they knew the reason for such behavior. And then they came to a sentence where here there's a matrix clause, right? So the students wish to listen to loud music that, so I gave them the matrix clause and their task was to complete the matrix clause according to the picture that they saw. So the picture here depicts the reason for the disconcerting behavior. So they needed to describe the reason, but in doing so, they needed to choose one of these verb forms. So the first one of the verb forms was always in the indicative mood, and the second verb form was in the subjunctive mood. So they chose the verb, they completed the sentence, and they submitted their response. So there were two different task versions. There was a simple task, and there was a complex task. Now, I want to be very clear. The complex task did everything that the simple task did, except that they needed to figure out the reason for the disconcerting behavior. So in the simple condition, I gave them the answer. The students in the complex condition had to look at 4 pictures and they had to figure out which was the reason, okay? So both, right, they submitted their responses, and depending on their verb choice, they either got the word yes, which meant that they got the response correct. If they chose the incorrect verb, they then got what we call a written recast, in which they saw the same sentence again with the correct verb form, and they were told to repeat the sentence out loud. So I want to be very clear about something. Also is that the stimuli was bimodal, and by that I mean that students heard these sentences and they read the sentences. And the reason for that is I did not want to put at a disadvantage either the heritage or the second language learner. So how did I measure their learning? So they were these assessment tasks that they did. Okay, so here they were instructed that they needed to complete the sentence in blue font. We prefer to go to museums and they needed to complete the sentence in blue font according to the picture that they saw, and also according to the sentence in black font here, right? So this sentence provided context to help them respond answer the prompt that they were given in the blue font. So there were 2 versions of the assessment task. One of the assessment tasks, they needed to produce this orally. And then in another version, they read the sentence and they had to write out their responses, okay? And very important, all the participants did an assessment task right after the experiment. And then I invited them to come back a week or 2 later after the experiment, and they needed to do another assessment task, because I wanted to see what they had retained after a week or 2. And also, just to say, there were 24 items in each assessment task. The experimental items were 12, in which 6 required the subjunctive and 6 required the indicative. And then there were other items that were distractor items, in which they were using past tense, future tense, present tense, and so forth. So I want to go first over the questionnaire data. So here I'm showing qualitative data, the questionnaire data. When they finished the experiment, after they came back a week or 2 weeks later, I asked the participants to report what they had learned from the experiment. So here I have classified comments according to what the heritage language learner said and according to what the second language learner said. So let's look at second language learners. Subjunctive, here we see subjunctive. When to use subjunctive. I started to understand some of the rules of use of the subjunctive. And this person was the only participant who got the rule. For adjective phrases, use the subjunctive if it is unsure. If the object exists, use the indicative when it is certain, right? So what we see here is that the second language learners are engaged in what we call hypothesis testing of the target form, right? They're trying to figure out how is the subjunctive being used throughout the experiment, okay? Now let's look at the heritage learners. I learned that I can speak Spanish in my own domain, but when asked the question, either I know it or I don't, I can't explain why, I just know it, right? how to find out what the problem was. So what was striking in these comments is that the heritage and the second language learners approached the task in very different ways. While the second language learners were focused on the target form, the heritage learners approached the task in a more communicative way, right? In order to solve the problem and reach the task goal. So moving on to some of the quantitative results, and here what we need to focus is, the first table is the immediate post-test, which means the assessment task they took right after the experiment. And we're gonna look here at Cohen's D. And remember, I mentioned that Cohen's D is the magnitude, right, of the experiment on their learning. So we see here that all groups, we see here some learning gains, but notice that the heritage learners who completed the complex condition, in other words, the one with the 4 pictures, they gained the least, right, from the other groups. When they came back 2 weeks later, 1 week, or I should say 1 week to 2 weeks later, these were the results. So all of these 3 groups here, they did pretty well, right? And they actually did somewhat better. But look what happened to the heritage learners in the complex condition, right? They actually did not retain the information that they had learned from the experiment, okay? So why is this? So here what we see is, and the reason I think this happened is because, remember, heritage learners approach the task in a communicative way, not as a language learning exercise to really learn the subjunctive. So what happened, I think what happened is that the complex condition, since their default was to approach the task in a communicative way, the complex condition exploited that, right? Because they needed to really figure out the reason and really engage their attentional resources in order to try to describe the reason or figure out the reason for the misbehavior. Whereas in the simple condition, I had provided them already the answer. So in that condition, they had their attentional resources were free or freer, we can say, in order for them to focus on the linguistic form. Okay, so moving on. So after I did this experiment, so these were the main findings. By the way, in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to expand on this. I'm just giving snapshots of the data, but I'm more than happy to elaborate on any of this. So after I did this experiment and looking at the briefing questionnaires, I was really struck by the fact that none of the heritage learners had mentioned the word subjunctive or engaging in metalinguistic knowledge. So I was very curious, and what I decided to do is do another study with the same task with a different group of heritage learners and second language learners. But in this study, what I did, as they were completing the task, I recorded their computer screen. And after they were done, I ran what's called a stimulated recall session. And in a stimulated recall session, what I did was I played the video back to the learners, okay, to the participants, and I paused the video at different points while they were completing the task. And I asked questions about their, what was going through their mind at that point in time. So one of the first questions was looking at the verb selection. So I paused the video at times when they were selecting one of the verbs, and I asked them, okay, what was going through your mind at that moment? So second language learners, again, what we expected, I knew that they weren't sure, so I chose the subjunctive, and it was ayude. Again, overwhelmingly, the second language learners, again, engaging in this hypothesis testing. I want us to look at heritage language learner number 9. I was trying to remember the infinitive, so I was thinking about desear, I was thinking about desear o querer, and so I was thinking it was subjunctive or regular. So here we have a heritage language learner where I said, bingo, right? We have a heritage language learner that has heard the word subjunctive and is using the word subjunctive, right, in the stimulated recall. But however, we also have this, no me acuerdo, I don't remember. It just sounded right saying it out loud. And then we had this student at the end, I just chose las anima because it would be like going out and obviously they're excited. Oh, you mean between these two? I was thinking in the present tense at the time. So what we see here that there's some type of variation in terms of how heritage learners were engaging with metalinguistic knowledge or the target form. We have heritage learners that reported that, right, like this one, I just sounded right saying out loud, right, going based on their intuition. But we also have other heritage learners engaging in hypothesis testing. So this is the feedback episode. So I also asked questions about, you know, when they chose the correct verb form and they got feedback, I asked them, okay, what was going through your mind at that moment? So again, here we see the second language learner. I'm not going to read it, but you can read it. But again, but there we see again, subjunctive, right? They were interested in the use of the subjunctive. Heritage learner number 9. I remember thinking if it was subjunctive, it would be animen, but it was anima, it was not, no subjunctive. So here, what we're seeing is that, again, participant number 9 is still engaging, right, in thinking about the subjunctive while completing the task. But then we have this person, I was wondering why it was wrong. I was like, what? I did not understand why it was san. And finally, this quote, this comment was interesting. Salgan didn't sound right to me at first. It was just that gut feeling that said that this doesn't make any sense. When I got it wrong, I said in mine, and that's why I didn't say right away, because in my mind, I was like, why is this wrong? Why is it Salgan? It didn't sound like Salgan went with it. It really didn't. So here, again, we see a variation on how they are responding to the feedback that they're getting during the experiment. Here, again, we see one of the participants engaging, thinking of the subjunctive, but we have a couple other participants where they're not understanding and they're going by that gut feeling, by their intuition. Again, so here, this is more evidence with the new group of learners, right, that they're approaching, they're engaging with the task in somewhat different ways. And then I asked them again, can you formulate a rule after doing the task? Again, second language learner, that when the speaker knows 100%, you're going to use indicative, but when there's doubt, use subjunctive, okay? Again, here, I'll let you read real quickly the heritage learner number 9. Again, remember, this was the heritage language learner who was engaging in hypothesis testing during the experiment, but we see at the end, it was a she did not really arrive at some rule. And then we have this other participant. I was thinking there was some type of pattern, I can tell, but I wasn't focusing on that. I was keeping on moving forward. I don't know, I needed to learn the pattern. Okay, so this person admits there was some rules, something going on, but you know, again, I wasn't focusing on that, right? So that for this person was not important. I want to make clear, which I don't think I've made clear, is that all of these participants are learners, meaning that they've been studying Spanish, right, for a while. So I want to be clear that I'm not grabbing heritage speakers from the streets, right? I did not grab them from the streets in order to come to the lab and do the experiment, right? So these are people recruited from classrooms, right, in which they have been studying Spanish for 2 or 3 years, okay? So, and finally, with this experiment, recently I reanalyzed for a book chapter the data, but I looked at the modality of assessment task. So what I did is I analyzed, again, all of the data with the heritage language learners, and I looked at whether or not, I was interested to see whether or not the modality of the assessment task had an impact or had an effect on, or altered, I guess we can say, altered the effects of instruction. So here what you can see, these are box plots, right? So the blue and the green are the oral assessment tasks. So what we see here is that the performance right after the experiment and a week or 2 weeks later, right, they're basically performing the same, right? So the gains were retained. However, look what happened in the blue and purple, which are the writing assessment tasks. So what we see here is was a lot more variation in the scores in the written assessment tasks right after the experiment. And then 2 weeks later, we saw that their performance was less, right? They did not do as well in 2 weeks later, 1 week to 2 weeks later. So this indicates to us that the assessment modality has an impact on the ability of heritage language learners to be able to retrieve, right, new linguistic information that they learn in the classroom. Again, let's think about their prior language experience, right? This goes back to the fact that they are using the heritage language in their communities to engage in more oral communication. So this is something to keep in mind. Okay, so we're moving on to language performance. So that's those studies. So for the language performance component of the talk, the task, this was a study that I did actually a few years ago, just a couple years ago, in which we tested advanced learners of Spanish, both heritage and second language learners who were Spanish majors and minors in our language program. And basically what we told them is that they were interacting with a partner. And basically we told them that they were hired as business consultants for 2 known Spanish companies. And there were 2 tasks that they completed, right? For task A, they needed to recommend a person for hiring from a number of profiles. So these are the profiles that they saw. They saw 6 of these profiles, and they needed to decide with their partner who was the ideal person for the position. But for task B, they saw different profiles, and they needed to recommend the laying off a person for that company. But for both task A and B, it's very important to know that they had to write a letter to the CEO of the company justifying their decision, okay? So I also will point out that every pair did 1 task in face-to-face mode, meaning, okay, face-to-face interaction, and they did another version of the other version in synchronous computer mediated communication, which is a fancy term for saying computer chat. So they use Skype, the chat box on Skype, in order to do and complete the task. Okay, so for this study, we analyzed their interactions, right? They're what we call in the interaction literature, interactionist literature, interaction moves, and I'm only going to focus on 2 that are relevant for now. So the first one that we coded were for self-repairs. So self-repairs are instances in which one of the learners produces a non-target-like utterance, and he or she corrects his or her non-target-like utterance. So for example, this is from our data set. This L2 learner said, same paragraph, but here there's a mismatch, right, between the grammatical gender of the noun and the grammatical gender here of the adjective. But if you notice, right, the same L2 learner who produced a non-target-like utterance repairs the non-target-like utterances later on, correcting his or her mistake, if you will. So self-repairs are indicative, we think, of students being aware, right, of their use of language, okay, and monitoring their language production. The other interaction move that I want to talk about is language-related episodes. And language-related episodes are basically instances in which learners talk about language issues. They talk about meta-talk, meta-linguistic issues, while they are engaging in meaning-oriented tasks. So for example, this is an example, again, from our data set. So whenever a partner or a learner asks a question, we say that is the initiation of a language-related episode, right? Or they have triggered an LRE. So for example, the L2 learner asks, how do you say downsizing, right? As they're writing the letter. The heritage language learner says, I don't know how you say downsizing. So this is an example of an LRE not resolved. And these are cases in which none of the participants or the, none of the learners appropriately addresses the LRE in question. But you can also have instances, this is an example of a heritage learner interacting with another heritage learner from our data set. And this heritage learner initiates the LRE by saying, would be, this is the verb would be in Spanish, would be has an accent on the I, and the second heritage learner says yes. So this is an example of an LRE being resolved, right? Because one of the learners appropriately addresses, right, the LRE in question. So what were some of the results here? So I want to walk you through this table. So here, I first want you to look here. These are HL-HL pairs. This means that these were heritage learners who were interacting with other heritage language learners. And here we have HL-L2 pairs, heritage learners interacting with second language learners. Okay, and then here we have FTF, which is face-to-face when they did the task face-to-face, and SCMC when they did the task through computer chat. So these are the relevant findings that I'm going to point out. The first one is this one. This was an interesting finding that heritage pairs only self-repaired in the computer chat condition. If you notice, they produce no self-repairs during face-to-face interaction, only in a computer chat. So this indicates that interacting through text chat in a computer, right, really raises heritage language learners' awareness to a certain extent about on non-target-like utterances that they may be producing during the interaction. The other finding we found is this one, in which the L2 pairs, right, initiated more LREs than the HL pairs. And this is not a novel finding. In fact, it's novel because these were advanced learners, but it's a replication of previous studies with intermediate level learners, that when heritage learners interact with second language learners are the ones producing most of the LREs. The reason for this is that we're seeing the following picture emerging, that heritage learners are positioned as language experts in these interactions, okay? So what we see is that most of the time, heritage learners are the ones resolving these LREs, which sort of indicates, right, that second language learners are benefiting from the knowledge of heritage language learners. And finally, the other significant result that I will mention is that heritage and HL and L2 pairs resolved more LREs in face-to-face mode, okay? And this was a different finding. And the reason why, as we looked more carefully into the data, what we found out is that the second language learners did not have as many questions, as many LREs when they interacted in the computer chat condition. And one of the reasons this is, and this is what the second language learners reported in the study, that they found that it was a lot easier to interact in the computer chat condition. So think about it, second language learners, right, their prior language experience it deals more with learning the language through written input, right? So they're exposed more to written input, so they feel more comfortable writing in Spanish. But also the computer chat condition provides learners with opportunities, or with more time, if you will, to prepare their response, right? They have more time to organize what they want to say, and so forth. Whereas interacting in face-to-face, there's more pressure, right, in that type of interaction, especially if you're interacting with a heritage learner, right? We're heritage learners who have strong oral communication skills. It's going to make that task more difficult for second language learners. For second language learners, then retrieving linguistic knowledge during face-to-face was more difficult than doing it in the computer chat condition. So those are those results. So this is the final study I will share.
And Julio, I'm gonna give you your time note. It's 4:50, and we do want to leave a couple of minutes
yes,
for questions.
I will go really fast here and wrap up. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so real quickly, so here this is the same study, the same participants, but this time I looked at the quality of their letters. I wanted to see whether or not these different pairs interacting across different modes affected the quality of their pair, their writing quality. So here, real quickly, I looked at accent placement accuracy and grammar accuracy. I'm gonna save the mystery and basically say that both pairs were not different as far as accuracy, as far as accent placement, and accuracy as far as grammar, okay? And this was surprising for the HL pairs, where we would assume that they would have more mistakes with accent placement. The reason for this, and this is some hope, that in order for our students to take content courses of linguistics, literature, they all take one or two writing courses where they get focused corrected feedback on accent placement. So this is why here, right, the heritage learners also performed as well when they were interacting with another heritage learner. The second thing I will mention is text complexity here. So here we can look at a simple sentence versus a sentence that is united by a conjunction, coordination, and also subordination. So here a subordinate clause is going to be more difficult to produce, right? Because it requires more cognitive effort. So here what we found is the following, that the HL-L2 pairs, right, had a higher ratio of coordination in their letters, which is indicative of a lower proficiency, whereas the heritage pairs had a higher ratio of subordination. So this indicates that when the heritage learner was interacting with the second language learner, it brought their performance down, okay? And again, I'm more than happy to talk about this if there are more questions about these results. And finally, these are the last results I'll show you. Here, I also looked at, okay, what about these syntactic complexity indices when it was face-to-face or computer chat? So as you can see here, this was a significant finding. And what I found basically is the following, that learners, when they were interacting in face-to-face mode, they produce fewer, they had a lower ratio of coordination when they were interacting in face-to-face, whereas interacting in computer chat, they had more issues, they had less evidence of subordination. So why is that? So I would have expected that the heritage learners, that the pairs would do better, right? My prediction was the pairs are going to do better and write more sophisticated texts when they're chatting on the computer, right? Because the modality matches the task outcome. However, this is what second heritage learners told me. One, I learned that oral communication is easier rather than writing everything down. I learned that it is easier for me to communicate with people face to face as opposed to messaging them through the computer. It is complicated to communicate through the computer because it takes longer, etc. I learned that it doesn't come easy to communicate when it comes to accomplishing the task over chat. In other words, the heritage language learners, it was challenging for them to complete this type of task over computers chat. So takeaway messages, and I will end. So number one, heritage learners, we saw approach task as meaning oriented. Again, they're not approaching tasks necessarily to engage in hypothesis testing as much as second language learners. This makes total sense. This has to do with their experience using the heritage language at home. They do not use the heritage language at home to learn about the subjunctive, to learn about the past tense, right? They're solving problems. They're engaging in authentic communicative events with their family members. And as such, heritage learners are relying more on their implicit knowledge resources. That means what sounds good to them, their gut feeling, their intuitions, right? So now the questions that we need to ask is, what happens with the explicit grammar knowledge that they're learning in our classes? What are they doing with that knowledge? And that's actually a study that I'm currently working on. Third, language in interactions with second language learners, they are positioned as language experts. Be aware of this when you have these mixed classes, right? Again, we've seen that second language learners are benefiting the most from these interactions, right? And in fact, we have evidence that heritage learners don't like that, okay? So this is something that we need to continue to unpack. Heritage learners are gonna be usually more proficient than L2 learners. So despite the fact we see in studies that L2 learners have significantly more classroom experience, heritage learners are still more proficient because the linguistic resources they're bringing in from home, from their community, is really helpful and is such an advantage for them. Again, how do we see these dynamics occurring? How, again, all of these things we need to question how we pair them in the classroom. And finally, modality matters on how heritage language learners respond to instruction. I think I showed you all 3 examples on how the modality of the assessment test, the modality of the interaction is going to have an effect, and it's going to alter the effects of instruction for heritage language learners. And because my time is way over, I will end it there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julio, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. You're raising lots of interesting snippets here. One question that came in via chat is, does your research recommend to separate the heritage language learners and the L2 learners and put them into different classes or tracks?
So that is a good question. So what we see is, so that's easier, right, said than done, because, right, it obviously depends on the resources that the university has, right, in order to provide that. What I think what the research shows that when heritage learners are interacting with other heritage learners, or when you have a class only with heritage learners, you can save time by targeting, right, different specific issues for heritage language learners. Whereas if you have a mixed class, right, now you have to address, right, 2 types of students, and you have to differentiate instruction, which means more work, right, for the instructor, and so forth. So ideally, it would be great to have separate tracks if possible, but I don't want to send the message that if they're mixed, it's doomed, right? Like there is no hope, right? Because what we're seeing is that what we need to figure out in research is how these dynamics are occurring. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot more research, but we're trying to understand what is it that they do in these interactions, right? And hopefully in a few years, in a couple years, we can give more concrete recommendations on how these pairings should occur. So I don't like to advocate for like separate programs. I think in my program, I'll give, in our program, we have writing courses that are separated for heritage and second language learners, and it works very well because we only have 10 weeks in a quarter. So we're able to target specific things for each type of learner.
Wonderful, thank you. So if people have more questions, please feel free to put them in chat or raise your virtual hand. We have a lot of thank yous that are filing in for you here, Julio, for the presentation and sharing your research. So there is one question, whether or not you give different tasks in the mixed classes.
So yeah, so I have a chapter, one of the chapters in the forthcoming edited volume. My colleague Melissa Burrell and I wrote a chapter on giving recommendations to teachers and instructions on how to adapt task-based language teaching. So what we're suggesting is that, right, that's a whole different workshop and talk, right, on how to do task-based methodology in the classroom. And yes, in that chapter, we sort of give recommendations on how to differentiate the task. Either you can differentiate the task or you can differentiate the activities that you do before and after the execution, after the task. So there are ways to do this, but yeah, that is a long answer. But we are working on so this book chapter is coming, and I must say that we are working on a book proposal, which will be in English, right? In which we hope to give examples of tasks, of task-based lessons, and recommendations to instructors on how to differentiate. So what I would suggest is think about the strengths and the needs of heritage language learners as well as second language learners, and then how do we alter these, right? And modify these in order for them to take advantage, right? And that the task-based interaction becomes a meaningful learning experience for both learners. Yeah, I'm sorry, I know that was not a complete answer, but I feel if I go into it, we're gonna need another hour.
Well, we will all be looking forward to when that new publication is coming out. And I think that also addressed another question that came in by tweet just now. But Sarah has her hand raised. Sarah, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Julio. Thank you so much for this.
Hi,
great.
Sarah.
So I have a question, and I'm hoping it makes sense. So when you were showing that the modality of the assessment task made a difference, so it mattered in the way the heritage speakers' responses, you showed those box plots, and they were great. But I'm curious about the consistency of the responses. We see that when you look at the means and the standard deviations for the heritage speakers are normally higher. There's a lot of variation within the responses. Did you find that for the oral assessment task, it was more consistent? Was everything pair like more consistently rather than the written one or not? I couldn't quite see that in your graph.
Yeah, and that's a forthcoming chapter. Yeah, and exactly, you're right. That's good key observation you made. Yes, even looking at the mean and looking in the chapter, I go into details about individual scores, right, to give a bigger picture. And yes, exactly that. There was not much variation in the oral performance. When they came back a week or two later, again, they basically maintained, but again, the variation was a lot greater for the written outcomes, which, right, indicates that they were having a more difficult time retrieving, right, the target form during the written assessment.
So for us doing research on instructed heritage language acquisition, would you then recommend that we use maybe 2 assessment tasks that have different modalities?
That's the point of the chapter. Yeah, you got to the thesis of the chapter. Basically their recommendation for teachers, right, for instructors, right, is they're gonna need more scaffolding, right, in written assessment, in writing assignments. But for researchers, I think what it revealed is that we need to test them in both modalities to see the effects of instruction, as the different modality may have an effect, right, or may alter the effects of instruction. And again, it's not rocket science, I feel, in part, right, because, right, their prior language experience, they're using the language to engage more in oral communication, which means, I think, is that their cognitive resources are freer, right, to be able to retrieve the language forms that they are using. Whereas for the written form, the processing is going to be more difficult. And again, it has to do with their cognitive resources, their attentional resources, their memory resources are compromised in the written assessment in order to retrieve the new language form. So yes, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, it's nice seeing you, by the way.
Great. Are there other questions for Julio? And while people are trying to maybe formulate their questions, you mentioned, Julio, that you are currently working on another study where you're looking at what happens with the explicit grammar knowledge. Are there preliminary results already, or is that still completely
we're in the design phase. So yeah, no, we are still in the design phase because one of the challenges of this study, so again, one of the questions I have is, okay, what are these kids doing? Because I know they're learning something in their classroom, they're learning, right? But so is it a question that they're not applying what they're learning, the explicit knowledge, when they do these tasks, right? Or is it something else? So a limitation that I will point out from my own research is that we need to do a better job in assessing the knowledge that they have, right? To see on whether or not it is, right, that they have the explicit knowledge, they don't really have it, and so forth. For one, I'm not interested, in my personal view, as a teacher, as a researcher, I'm not really interested on whether or not learners can conjugate verbs on a worksheet. I really am not interested in that. I'm interested when they do these tasks. They have to write a business letter. They have to solve this problem. I'm interested whether or not they recruit, right? They rely, they access these types of knowledge in order to solve a task. And that's what I'm after. So in this study, what we're looking at that, we're designing to see whether or not explicit knowledge and timing of instruction, whether we give explicit instruction before the task or after the task is more effective as well. There's evidence to suggest that going over grammar after the task may be more effective for learning than before. So unfortunately, it's been still going. We actually are basically almost done. So I hope to be piloting now in the fall. But again, it's taking time because we want to make sure that the explicit instruction is quality, right? Because we want them to learn the target form to be sure when they do the task, right, that we can measure and say, look, they had explicit knowledge and this is what they did, right? And yeah, so, or is it that, oh, I don't care about the explicit knowledge, I'm just gonna go back to my implicit knowledge, right? And what works for me in my community, what works for me at home, and that's how I'm going to do the task. So yeah, so I'm sorry, Angelica, I owe you that.
No. I mean, as you said, you can only pack so much into a very limited time frame that we're giving you here.
Yeah.
So there is one more question on chat, and I think we'll close with that question. You mentioned translanguaging. Can you explain that more?
So translanguaging is, and I'm gonna use the term sexy term, right, that's being used now. And it really is being used in the field of bilingual education. And basically what translanguaging, and this is work that especially is being done by Ofelia Garcia and her students. And basically what translanguaging is learners, viewing learners' bilingual systems as one. Right? So the idea is that these systems are not two separate systems, they're one whole system, and that these boundaries that we associate with language are more external, they're political, they're social, but that bilingual children, bilingual speakers are recruiting both languages, are using both languages without these boundaries. So that's sort of, I think, hopefully that makes sense of what translanguaging is. I know it's sometimes confused with what code switching is, right? But people who advocate for translanguaging say it is not the same as code switching, but I will say that other people are using it in a more broader sense as well. But I think if we stick to what Ofelia Garcia and her colleagues are telling us, that's how they see translanguaging. Yeah, so again, translanguaging can be that they're switching from one language to another. Translanguaging could be that they're creating new words, right? Using morphemes from one language and then putting them in the other, right? And all these practices that bilinguals do, right? On a daily basis.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you again, Julio, for joining us today, all the way from California, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. As a reminder, there will also be a follow-up podcast episode with Julio. Our new season will actually launch tomorrow, and Julio's podcast episode will be released next week. Also a reminder about the next speaker who will join us on Wednesday, October 7th at 4:30 p.m. That's Kate Pisani from the University of Minnesota, who will talk about multiliteracies, pedagogy, and teacher professional development from research to practice. So again, Julio, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you everybody for joining. We will be hanging around here for maybe 5 more minutes. So if there are questions for Julio that you would like to ask still, you are welcome to do so before we whisk him away into a different Zoom room to record our podcast episode. So
thank you, everyone. This was such a pleasure. Thank you.